I had been looking forward to that camping trip for months. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 24. I'd been working long hours at a warehouse job near Manchester, barely seeing the daylight outside of work. When a mate of mine canceled last minute, I decided to go alone rather than waste the weekend. I wanted space, quiet, and that sharp, damp air you only get out in the countryside. I picked a small site just outside of Peak District, not an official campsite with facilities, but one of those secluded spots people mention online when talking about wild camping. I packed light: a one-person tent, sleeping bag, some instant noodles, a torch, and a small camping stove. I drove out late afternoon on a Friday, the sun still hanging in the sky, burning the tops of the rolling green hills. The narrow country roads were lined with hedges taller than the car, and once I parked in a small lay-by, I walked a half-mile into a patch of woodland that felt private enough. The ground was uneven, soft from weeks of rain, and the trees kept the area dim even though the sky was still bright. I pitched the tent on the flattest patch I could find. The fabric looked small against the endless stretch of trees. I remember feeling satisfied as I zipped it up, knowing I had the place to myself. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional caw of a crow or the rustle of something small moving in the undergrowth. After a simple meal of noodles and tea, I walked around the edges of the woods as the sun began to set. The light dipped behind the hills and the whole area turned from gold to a deep, shadowy green. I returned to my tent just as the chill crept in. I lit a small fire and sat on a log I had dragged over, watching the flames spit and crack. That's when I first saw her. It was quick, almost too quick to process. Across the treeline, maybe 40 feet away, there was the faint shape of someone standing still. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or my eyes playing tricks in the flickering firelight. But when I stared longer, I could make out a figure. A woman. She was standing just past the nearest set of trees, facing my direction. She didn't move. I remember the way my stomach dropped. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just another camper, a hiker passing through, someone from one of the nearby farms. But the longer I looked, the stranger it felt. She was too still, too quiet. No shifting weight, no moving arms, nothing. I told myself to ignore it. I went back into the tent, zipped it up, and lay inside my sleeping bag, torch off. My ears strained for sound. Nothing, just the occasional creak of branches above. I must have lain there for hours, tossing and turning, checking the time on my phone every 10 minutes. Midnight came, then 1 in the morning. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep. A snapping branch woke me. I held my breath. It had come from close by, maybe 10 feet from the tent. The sound of shoes pressing into wet ground followed. Soft, deliberate steps. My mouth went dry, and my heartbeat hammered in my chest so hard I swore it would give me away. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps circled slowly around the tent. A twig cracked, then another. I imagined her, because in my head it was her, standing right outside, watching the thin wall of fabric separating us. My torch was within reach, but I didn't dare grab it. I didn't want to make a sound. After what felt like forever, the steps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes wide open, body rigid inside the sleeping bag. When daylight finally crept through the fabric, I unzipped the tent cautiously. My throat was tight, my body stiff. The ground outside was damp and scattered with leaves. I checked for footprints, but the soft earth was messy with old impressions, animal tracks, and my own. I couldn't be sure if there had been anyone at all. Still, the unease clung to me. I thought about packing up right there, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been a deer or fox moving around. Maybe my brain had turned a shadow into a figure. I tried to brush it off, boiling water for coffee and sitting in the cool morning air. By mid-afternoon, I felt more normal. I even convinced myself to go on a small hike further into the hills. The day was warm, sheep dotted the fields in the distance, and the trails were quiet. I returned to my camp tired, sweaty, and hungry, ready for another night, determined not to spook myself again. That evening, the fire burned brighter, the woods darker around it. I tried to focus on the crackle of flames, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustle of leaves. But every so often, I caught myself glancing at the same tree-line, half expecting her to be there again. And then she was, this time closer, maybe 20 feet away, standing between two thin trees, her body half hidden in shadow. My stomach turned to ice. She wasn't moving, just standing and facing me. I could make out more this time. Dark hair hanging loose, clothing that looked pale against the dark bark. I didn't light the torch or call out. I just sat frozen. Minutes passed. She didn't shift an inch. Couldn't take it. I grabbed the torch, switched it on, and shone it directly where she was. Nothing. Just trees and empty space. I turned the light off, hands shaking, heart racing. I swear she had been there. I hadn't imagined it. I knew I hadn't. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright in the tent, torch in my lap, knife from the cooking set by my side. Every little noise outside made my skin prickle. At one point, I heard slow, deliberate breathing so faint, it might have been my imagination. But it felt too close, just outside the thin nylon wall. The hours dragged on, but eventually, the blackness of night gave way to pale gray. When the first light hit, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything as quickly as I could, my hands clumsy and unsteady. The fire pit was still warm as I stamped it out. I shoved everything into the rucksack, hardly caring if it was neat. As I slung the bag over my shoulders and turned toward the path back, I froze. At the far end of the tree-line, where the shadows hadn't yet lifted, stood a figure. The same one. This time, there was no mistaking it. The woman, still silent, watching. I didn't look twice. I walked as fast as I could back toward the lay-by, not running, but close to it, heart thumping so loud I thought it would echo off the trees. Every step, I expected to hear another set behind me, but there was only silence. When I reached the car, I threw the bag inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine stuttered to life, and I pulled away, glancing in the mirrors more than the road. I didn't stop until I was back in town, concrete and streetlights all around me. I've never gone camping alone again. Even now, years later, I can't explain what I saw. Maybe it was some local living rough, maybe someone unstable who wandered the woods. But the way she stood there, the silence, the way she seemed to disappear when I shone the light, it's something I can't shake. All I know is that she was real, and she was watching me. I was 24 the summer I decided to camp alone near the Welsh countryside. It was July 2016, and I had just bought a small second-hand tent, nothing fancy, just a cheap dome-style one with thin poles that felt like they could bend in a strong wind. I wanted quiet, time away from the noise of Cardiff, so I drove my little car down narrow lanes until I reached an open patch of farmland near a thick tree line. It wasn't an official campsite, but I had spoken with the landowner earlier that day. He didn't seem to care as long as I stayed away from his cattle and didn't leave rubbish. The sky had been gray since morning, and by late afternoon it had started to drizzle. The air was heavy, damp, and it carried that earthy smell of wet soil mixed with the sharp scent of grass. I remember how sticky my shirt felt as I unpacked, my palms damp from both sweat and rain. I staked the tent close to the tree line, thinking the branches above might shield it from some of the rain. Behind me, The open field stretched for what looked like half a mile until it dropped into a darker valley. By the time I had the tent upright, the drizzle had grown into a steady rain. Drops rattled against the nylon, the sound like a constant tapping. I crawled inside, pulled my rucksack in with me, and sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag. The inside smelled faintly of plastic and mildew, the kind of smell secondhand gear always seems to have no matter how many times you try to air it out. I had packed a small torch, some snacks, a bottle of water, and a folding knife I kept more for peace of mind than anything else. My phone showed no signal. The last time I checked, I had one bar while parking near the farm gate, but here, closer to the trees, there was nothing. I didn't think much of it. I wasn't planning on scrolling through social media anyway. The rain grew harder as the evening deepened. By 8, the sky was dark, and the only light I had was my torch. I switched it off after a while to save the batteries, letting the tent sink into darkness. The sound of rain became louder, heavier, almost deafening at times when the wind drove it sideways into the thin fabric walls. I lay down on my back, staring at the vague outline of the tent ceiling just inches above my face. At some point, I dozed. The rain hadn't stopped when I woke again, but what pulled me out of sleep wasn't the weather. It was a different noise. At first, I thought it was part of the storm, the shifting of branches, the slap of water-heavy leaves. But then I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They pressed into the wet soil outside, close enough that I could feel faint vibrations through the ground. My chest tightened. My first thought was the farmer checking if I was still there, but it felt too late, too strange. I checked my watch just past midnight. Whoever it was, they weren't moving fast, just steady steps, circling the tent. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening to the sound of water dripping from their clothes, mixing with the constant hiss of rain. I could picture boots squelching in mud, someone heavy shifting their weight carefully. They stopped on the side where my head rested, just a thin sheet of fabric between us. I could hear water pattering off them, the faint rasp of breath. My mind raced. I thought about unzipping the tent, jumping out, and demanding who they were, but something inside me told me to wait, to stay hidden. If it was the landowner, why wouldn't he call out? Why just circle? After what felt like forever, the steps began again, moving toward the trees. Branches cracked softly under their weight, and then the sound faded. I stayed frozen, counting in my head, waiting for the noise to return. Didn't. The rain kept falling, and eventually, after half an hour or so, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep. When I woke again, it was to a different sound, the sharp tear of nylon fabric. My eyes flew open. For a second, I couldn't place it. Then I saw the faint outline of a cut forming near the base of the tent, the blade dragging slowly through the material. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached for my torch and knife at the same time, flicking the light on. The beam hit the damp walls of the tent, the small space glowing white. The cutting stopped immediately. Whoever was outside froze. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Rain hammered the roof. My hand shook as I gripped the knife, though it felt pathetically small. Then came the footsteps again, quick this time, retreating. I heard them squelch back into the trees, branches snapping as they pushed deeper. I sat there shaking, the torch beam jittering against the fabric. The rip wasn't big, maybe 5 or 6 inches long, but it was enough to make me understand that whoever had been there wasn't curious. They wanted in. I knew I couldn't stay. Every part of my body screamed at me to leave before they came back. I shoved everything into my bag as fast as I could, barely caring about neatness. The rain poured harder when I crawled out, the cold slapping against my face. My trainers sank into the mud as I stumbled toward the open field. The night was pitch black except for the faint outline of the valley below. My torch beam cut a narrow path, but beyond it was nothing but rain and shadows. My car was at the far end of the field near the gate, maybe a 10-minute walk. Each step felt like dragging myself through quicksand. The ground sucked at my shoes, the rain blinded me, and every noise, the wind, the water, the shift of leaves, sounded like someone running behind me. Halfway across, I stopped. Something moved at the edge of the field, near the line of trees. A dark shape, tall, barely visible through the rain. It wasn't coming toward me, just standing there, watching. My stomach dropped. I didn't wait to make sense of it. I forced my legs forward, slipping in the mud, almost falling more than once. When I finally reached my car, my hands were trembling so badly I struggled with the keys. The metal slipped, scraped against the lock, until finally it clicked open. I threw my bag in, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the doors shut. My breath fogged the glass instantly. I started the engine, the headlights slicing through sheets of rain. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the empty field. The dark shape by the trees was gone. Only the rain remained, pounding against the windshield. I drove out fast, tires spinning in the mud before catching on the gravel road. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that field. The next morning, I checked the tent. The cut was clean, too precise to be an accident. The thin nylon sagged around it like an open wound. That image stayed with me. Whoever was out there, they weren't lost hikers or farmers. They came prepared, in the dead of night, with a knife sharp enough to slice through fabric in one smooth motion. I never camped alone again after that. Even now, years later, the memory of that night in the rain clings to me. The sound of footsteps outside thin fabric, the rip of a knife, the silhouette in the field. It plays in my head whenever storms roll in. And I always lock my doors twice before going to bed, because I learned that night how close danger can stand in the dark. Just waiting, just watching. I was 23 years old when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. It was the summer of 2015, late July, and the air in northern Idaho was dry, warm during the day, and heavy with the smell of pine and dust. I had been working long hours in construction that year, and my back felt broken most days, but I wanted to get away from the city and breathe clean air. I picked a spot near Priest Lake, far enough from the busy campgrounds that I wouldn't hear other people. I thought I needed silence, just the sound of trees, water, and the crack of firewood. The drive up took about 3 hours. The dirt roads narrowed the further I went, and every bump rattled through my old Ford Ranger. I had stocked the truck with water jugs, a cooler with sandwiches, some canned chili, a tent, sleeping bag, and a lantern. My phone barely held a signal after the first hour, and by the time I reached the edge of the Forest Service land, there was no service at all. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to be cut off. The campsite I picked wasn't official. It was one of those pull-off clearings with a rough fire ring made from old stones someone had stacked years before. Moss grew between the rocks, and charred black pieces of wood lay scattered. I parked, stepped out, and stretched my legs. The air smelled sharper up there, a mix of sap and wet earth. The lake was maybe half a mile down a narrow game trail I could just barely see through the trees. No other cars were around, no tire tracks fresher than a week. Felt like I had the place to myself. I spent the late afternoon setting up. I laid out the green dome tent on a flat spot, hammered in the stakes, unrolled the sleeping bag inside, and put my cooler under the shade of a tree. I gathered some wood nearby, dry sticks and branches that cracked easily when bent. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was dropping, and the sky glowed orange through the treetops. I lit a small fire and heated some chili, eating it straight from the can with a metal spoon. The forest grew darker around me, and the sounds shifted. Birds going quiet, insects buzzing louder, and the occasional thump of a pine cone hitting the ground. I told myself it was perfect. This was what I came for. But when the last streaks of light bled out of the sky, the silence got heavier. I had camped before, but never alone, and I hadn't realized how different it would feel without someone else's breathing or voice nearby. Every sound snapped sharper. Every twig breaking somewhere in the trees made me pause. I kept looking over my shoulder, convincing myself it was deer or maybe a squirrel. By 10, the fire burned low, and I crawled into the tent. The nylon walls felt thinner than I remembered from camping as a kid, like I was wrapped in paper. I laid down, trying to relax, but I kept hearing things. Leaves brushing, a faint crunch of steps stopping, then nothing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I must have drifted off around midnight because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, heart racing. I didn't know why I woke up at first. Then I realized the fire was completely out. No glow at all. The forest was pitch black, thick with clouds covering the moon. I listened, and I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, moving just outside the ring of where the fire had been. Not heavy like a bear, not quick like deer. Human. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt my whole body lock tight. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps circled, crunching softly on the needles and dry ground, then stopping. For long stretches, there was silence, but I could feel it. Someone was out there. My tent zipper was shut, and I was inside with nothing but a small pocket knife in my pack. No gun, no real weapon, just me, lying frozen while someone walked around my camp. The sound went on for what felt like forever, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Once, I swore I heard the sound of something brushing against my cooler, the faint scrape of plastic shifting. I pictured some drifter, someone living out in the woods, hungry, curious, maybe dangerous. My mouth was dry, and I could taste fear like metal in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I knew better. I just stayed still. At some point, exhaustion must have taken me again, because I woke to gray light filtering through the tent. My body was stiff, my face damp with sweat. I unzipped the tent carefully, expecting to see someone still there, but the clearing was empty. The fire ring looked the same, but the cooler was shifted a couple of feet, tilted slightly. The lid was still closed. I walked around slowly, checking the ground, and saw footprints in the dirt. Clear shoe prints, not boots or hiking shoes, but worn sneakers. They circled my tent, looping around several times before heading back into the trees. My chest felt tight as I stared at them. This hadn't been in my head. Someone really had been out there all night. I thought about packing up right then, but I told myself maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe they were gone now. I forced myself to stay calm, made a quick breakfast of bread and peanut butter, and walked down to the lake. The water was still, a silver mirror under the early sky. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't stop thinking about the prints. I kept checking over my shoulder on the walk back. When I reached camp again, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the stakes on my tent was pulled halfway out, like someone had tugged at it. My stomach dropped. I didn't even eat lunch. I just packed everything fast, shoving the sleeping bag into the truck, loading the cooler, stomping out the dead fire, and folding the tent without care. My hands shook the whole time. I couldn't stop imagining someone standing there during the night, pulling at the tent, maybe deciding whether to open it. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless. Every bend I expected to see another car blocking me, or someone standing in the middle. But the road stayed empty, the forest passing by in thick walls of green. When I finally reached the main highway, the tension in my chest eased just enough that I could breathe normally again. Back in town, I parked at a gas station and just sat in the truck for a while, staring at people walking in and out, normal people in daylight, safe and ordinary. It struck me how quickly things could turn. Out there, in the dark, no one would have known where I was. No phone service, no help if I screamed. Just me and whoever was circling my camp. I never went back to Priest Lake after that. I still camp sometimes, but only with friends, never alone. And I always make sure the fire burns through the night. That trip taught me something real. The woods aren't scary because of bears or mountain lions. The scariest thing you can run into out there is another person. I still remember that night on the farm like it happened yesterday, even though years have gone by. I was 21 at the time, restless and stubborn, and I thought it would be a good idea to camp out by myself on a piece of land my uncle owned in rural Kentucky. It was late summer of 1998. The air was heavy and still, and the fields around his property stretched out flat in every direction, broken only by tree lines and old fence posts leaning at odd angles. I had told myself I wanted to spend a night out there for the quiet, for the escape, for the simple idea of being alone under the sky without anyone nearby. But deep down, I think I wanted to test myself, to see if I could handle being in the middle of nowhere in the dark. My uncle's farm had a big white barn that was already falling apart back then. The paint peeled off in sheets, and the roof sagged a little where the wood underneath had rotted. Behind it were acres of fields that he mostly used for hay, with long grass that reached up to my waist if I walked through it. Farther back, beyond the last field, there was a strip of woods that looked black once the sun went down. I picked a spot near the edge of the fields, a couple 100 feet from the barn, where the grass was low and the ground was fairly level. I brought a small 2-person tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a cheap camping stove. I set everything up just before sunset, the sky orange and purple, the sound of cicadas echoing from every corner of the fields. The air smelled like dirt and hay, sharp and dry, and the barn creaked now and then as if it were breathing. First, it was peaceful. I ate some canned beans heated on the stove, drank a bottle of water, and sat in front of the tent watching the horizon fade into dark. But the quiet didn't last the way I thought it would. When the sun slipped away, the fields changed. The crickets got louder, the cicadas cut off almost instantly, and everything felt sharper. The sound of the wind moving through the grass seemed closer than before, like it wasn't just the wind anymore, but something heavier moving along with it. From where I sat, I could see the outline of the barn, its broken windows black and empty. I kept looking at them longer than I wanted to, waiting for some movement I couldn't explain. By midnight, the farm had turned into a place that felt nothing like the one I had known during the day. Lying in my sleeping bag, I could hear things I couldn't name. Rustling in the grass, faint cracks of twigs, something brushing against the barn wall far off. Each sound made me lift my head, shine the flashlight around, and then lower it again when nothing showed. The beam of the light didn't carry far in the fields. It lit the grass, lit the fence post, lit the side of the barn, but everything past that was swallowed in black. The first real jolt came around 1 in the morning. I was half asleep when I heard footsteps, not heavy ones, but careful ones, moving in the grass just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. The steps were slow, not the kind of quick movement you'd expect from a rabbit or raccoon. They circled halfway around the tent before stopping. I froze, holding my breath, gripping the flashlight tight in my hand. For what felt like a full minute, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard the sound of something metallic, like a piece of wire or a tool lightly tapping against another metal surface. My uncle had left all kinds of rusted equipment leaning against the barn, so it could have been that, but the sound was too close, too deliberate. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed on my back, flashlight in hand, listening. I kept telling myself it was probably just a stray dog or maybe a deer nosing around, but the way those footsteps had stopped right beside me made my skin crawl. Around 2, I thought I heard something tugging at the zipper of the tent. just a small shift of the fabric, like fingers testing it. I snapped on the flashlight and shone it against the flap, but of course, the outside looked empty. The minutes dragged. Every time I thought I was calming down, a new sound would come. Dull thuds from the barn, rustling grass, something that sounded almost like breathing. I realized how thin that tent really was, how useless it would be if someone actually wanted to get inside. The thought hit me then, clear and heavy. I wasn't afraid of animals. I was afraid of a person out there. By 3 in the morning, I couldn't take lying still anymore. I unzipped the tent slowly, my hands shaking, and slipped outside with the flashlight. The air was thick and damp, and the beam cut across the field in a pale cone. I turned in circles, scanning the grass, the barn, the fence line. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided I'd had enough and started packing up. My plan was simple: throw my bag and tent in the trunk of my car and drive back to my uncle's house. But as I pulled the stakes from the ground, I heard the barn creak again, louder this time, followed by a dull slam, like a door being shut or something heavy falling inside. My chest tightened. The barn was supposed to be empty. My uncle hadn't kept animals in there for years. I didn't wait to find out. I shoved the tent into the bag without folding it and grabbed everything in one armful. The field felt endless as I hurried across it, every few steps glancing over my shoulder. The barn loomed to my right, and I swore I caught a glimpse of movement in the window, a darker shape shifting in the black. I kept walking faster, almost jogging, until I reached my car parked by the gravel road. When I got inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and aimed the headlights toward the barn. The beams washed over the sagging wood and broken glass. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway, just past where the light ended. My stomach dropped, but before I could focus on it, the shape seemed to blend back into the shadows. I didn't look again. I threw the car into drive and sped down the gravel road, dust flying behind me. I didn't tell my uncle what happened the next morning. I just said the camping trip was fine, but that I preferred sleeping indoors. He nodded, didn't ask questions, and I left it at that. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep right. Every creak of my apartment floor, every tap on the window during a windy night, sent me back to that field. Looking back now, I still don't know for certain what was out there. Maybe it was just a drifter who had been using the barn for shelter. Maybe it was someone passing through the fields. Maybe they had no idea I was even there at first. But the way they circled the tent, the way the zipper moved, the way the barn door slammed, it was deliberate. Somebody knew I was there, and they wanted me to know it too. That was the first and last time I camped on that farm. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2014. I was 27 then, living in northern Colorado, and I had this idea that going out by myself would give me some kind of peace of mind I had been missing for months. I picked a spot about 2 hours outside Fort Collins, a quiet stretch of national forest land that wasn't crowded like the more popular campgrounds. It wasn't an official site with marked spots, just a rough dirt road that ended in a wide clearing with enough room for a tent and a fire ring. I parked my old Jeep near the tree line, carried my gear down closer to the clearing, and set up my tent before the sun dropped too low. The evening was quiet, only the sound of insects and the occasional call of a bird settling into the trees. I cooked on a small stove, ate quickly, and then sat watching the woods darken while the air cooled. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the only light left was the faint glow of the coals from my small fire. I was used to camping with friends, with laughter, voices, and company, but this was different. The silence pressed against my ears. It was the kind of silence that makes every small sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, feel far too loud. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up. I didn't know what stirred me at first, but my heart was already beating faster than it should have been for someone just waking up. The tent walls shifted slightly in the faint breeze, and I heard something outside. At first, it was a soft, steady crunch, like footsteps moving across the forest floor. Not the quick steps of a deer bounding through the brush, but slow, deliberate steps. I froze in my bag, barely breathing, my ears straining. The footsteps stopped not far from my tent. I could hear the weight of someone shifting. My stomach tightened. I knew that sound wasn't from an animal. There was a rhythm to it, the slow shifting of weight from one foot to the other. My first thought was that maybe another camper had wandered near, maybe lost or drunk. But the road was empty, and I hadn't seen a single vehicle all day. The realization made my chest tighten even more. The minutes dragged. I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, listening, every muscle locked. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound started again. A slow circling. Whoever or whatever, it was moved around the tent, quiet but not quiet enough to disguise that it was a person. I could hear sticks snapping softly under their weight. I could feel them stopping every few steps, pausing, waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the tent to peek. I was terrified that any sound I made would give me away more than I already was. But the truth was, the person already knew I was there. My Jeep was parked just up the dirt road. My tent was in plain sight if anyone walked into the clearing. The circling went on for maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. Time felt stretched out in the dark. Then it stopped. Total silence again, except for the soft rush of blood in my ears. I waited and waited, not sure if the person was gone or just standing still. My throat was dry. My palms were wet. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to glance at my watch by pressing the side button, just enough to light up the face. It was 2:47 a.m. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed frozen in place, eyes fixed on the faint ceiling of the tent, until the first gray light crept in. When I finally unzipped the door and stepped out, the clearing looked the same as when I had set up camp. But the ground told another story. In the soft dirt just beyond the ring of dead grass, I saw shoe prints, clear as day. The tread wasn't like hiking boots. It looked more like worn work boots. The prints circled around the tent, then drifted off into the trees. They weren't mine. I could see my own fresh tracks from when I set up camp, different size, different shape. My skin crawled. I didn't cook breakfast. I didn't even bother rolling up my sleeping bag properly. I stuffed everything into the Jeep, heart pounding, scanning the trees constantly, waiting for someone to step out. Nobody did. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the brush as I turned the key, backed up, and drove out along the dirt road. The whole way home, I kept looking in my mirrors. I told myself it could have been just a hiker, maybe someone curious, maybe someone who had been passing through. But hikers don't usually circle a tent in the middle of the night. They don't stand still listening. For a few weeks, I tried to reason it away. Maybe it was some local guy out hunting, maybe someone who had been drinking and wandered through. But then I thought about the slowness of those footsteps, the way they paused like they were testing me, waiting for me to move. Whoever it was had no reason to be out there that time of night, with no campfire, no flashlight, nothing. I didn't camp alone again after that. Not once. Even now, years later, when I do go with friends, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, ears straining, waiting to hear those steps again. Looking back, what unsettles me most isn't just the prints, or the circling, or the silence afterward. It's the fact that I'll never know what that person wanted. They could have been just curious, but curiosity doesn't explain why someone lingers outside a tent at nearly 3 in the morning, standing in the dark, just listening. What I know for sure is this. If I hadn't stayed still, if I had unzipped that tent or coughed, or made the slightest movement, whoever was out there would have known exactly how awake and aware I was. Maybe that was what they were waiting for. And that's the part that keeps me up sometimes. Because in the silence of those woods, I realize something I can't shake. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the sound of footsteps, but the moment they stop. I was 24 in the summer of 2016, living in Arizona and working at a small mechanic shop. I didn't have much money, but I always made time to get outdoors on weekends. That July, I decided to drive out to an area about 40 miles north of Flagstaff, close to the Navajo reservation. I'd been told it was quiet, with wide stretches of forest and high desert, and not many campers around. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my old green tent, a sleeping bag, some water jugs, and enough food to last me a couple of nights. The drive out there was dry and lonely. The two-lane road stretched long between patches of pine trees and brush. By the time I turned off onto a dirt track, the sun was sliding down low. I bounced over rocks and dips until I found a clearing a few hundred yards off the road. It felt private, quiet, and just far enough from anyone else. I set up my tent near a line of pines, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going with the bundle of wood I'd brought. That first night felt fine. A little breeze pushed through the trees, and the sky was bright with stars. I cooked a small meal, ate by the fire, and listened to the quiet. Coyotes called in the distance, but nothing unusual. I slept without much trouble. The second day, I hiked around for hours. I followed a shallow creek that twisted between the trees, spotted a few deer, and even saw some boot prints that looked pretty old. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, tired and dusty. I sat by the fire again as night came on. The air was still warm, but the quiet felt heavier that evening, like the woods had hushed up for a reason. I shook the feeling off and crawled into my tent once the fire burned down. I woke in the middle of the night to footsteps. At first I thought it was deer again, but these steps were different. They were slow, heavy, and close. I held still in my sleeping bag, listening. The dirt outside crunched under weight, circling near my tent. I could make out the sound of breathing, low, steady, almost deliberate. My heart thumped hard in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent wall. For a long minute, nothing happened. I stared at the thin fabric, waiting for a shadow, but there was nothing. Then came a strange noise. It wasn't quite human, and it wasn't quite animal either. It was like someone trying to copy a dog's bark but failing. Low, broken, drawn out. My mouth went dry. I reached slowly for the hatchet I kept inside, pressing my palm around the handle. I didn't move, just listened. The sound came again, this time more like a person coughing but twisted, strained. Then silence. After a few long minutes, the footsteps moved away, crunching off toward the trees. I lay there, wide awake, until dawn finally came. When I stepped outside, I saw prints in the dirt. They weren't clear shoe prints, and they weren't quite animal tracks either. They looked like bare feet, but stretched too long, with toes spread wide apart. I counted 4 or 5 steps around the tent before they veered back toward the woods. My stomach tightened as I looked at them. I told myself it must have been some drifter, maybe barefoot, maybe drunk. I wanted to believe that. I considered packing up right then, but pride and stubbornness kept me there. I didn't want to feel chased out of the woods by some weirdo. I spent the day near camp, though, keeping my hatchet close. Every so often, I felt eyes on me. I'd glance up at the tree line, swearing I saw movement, but nothing clear enough to prove it. As night came again, I didn't build much of a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food from a can and sat quietly. Once the sky turned black, I got inside the tent and zipped it shut, keeping my hatchet by my side. It didn't take long before I heard it again. Footsteps. They came from the same side, crunching slowly through the dirt. My skin prickled. Then I heard something worse. A voice said my name, not loud, but just clear enough. Stretched, broken, like someone forcing the sound out wrong. Hearing my own name out there in the dark made every part of me go cold. I held still, every muscle tight, trying not to breathe too loud. The voice repeated it closer now. The footsteps circled the tent. My heart slammed so hard I thought it might give me away. Then came a laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded like someone trying to copy the idea of laughing, high and shaky, cut short halfway. I couldn't take it anymore. I gripped the hatchet and burst out of the tent, yelling as loud as I could. My flashlight beam cut across the clearing. For a split second, I saw something between the trees. It looked like a person, tall and thin, bent at the shoulders, arms too long, skin pale in the beam. It turned its head toward me, and even though the face was hard to make out, I swear it looked stretched wrong, like it didn't belong to the body. The light shook in my hand as the thing turned and bolted into the trees faster than any person should be able to move. Branches cracked and snapped as it went deeper until the sound faded out. I stood there, shaking so hard I thought my knees would give out. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat by the fire I lit back up, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other, staring at the trees until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed up fast. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag into the car. I didn't even bother folding the tent. I just threw it in. The tracks near the tree line were clear again. Long, barefoot impressions leading away. I drove out of there fast, barely looking in the mirrors. My mouth was dry, my eyes sore, my head heavy from no sleep. By the time I hit the highway, I promised myself I'd never camp alone out there again. I've been back in the woods since then, but not alone and never near that area. When people ask me why, I just say I had a bad experience. I don't tell them the whole story. It sounds too strange, too close to stories you hear in whispers about the desert and the reservation lands. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know there was nothing fairy tale about it. Whatever was out there that night was real, and it wanted me to know it was watching. I was 23 when I went on that camping trip. It was late September of 2017, and the air had already begun to shift from summer warmth to the kind of coolness that sinks into your clothes after sunset. I had taken a few days off from work and decided to drive out to a state forest in northern Michigan. It wasn't a tourist-heavy area, just quiet woods that stretched on for miles, and that's exactly what I wanted. I had grown up camping with my family, so being out there alone didn't scare me. In fact, it was what I craved. I wanted silence, distance from people, the comfort of trees and the crunch of soil under my boots. I brought my gear, a small tent, some simple food, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight. Nothing fancy. I wasn't going out for an adventure, just a quiet escape. The spot I chose wasn't on a marked campground. I had hiked a few miles off the trail until I found a clearing that seemed right. It was surrounded by tall pines and birch, the ground carpeted in brown needles. There was a large fallen tree on the edge of the clearing, half-rotted and covered in moss, that I figured would work as a natural bench. I pitched my tent a little ways from it, set down my pack, and felt satisfied with the spot. The first day passed quietly. I walked around, collected some dry sticks for a fire, and spent the evening listening to the forest settle down as the light faded. When night fell, I lit my fire and cooked some canned beans. The forest was alive with small sounds: raccoons, owls, branches creaking under the weight of the wind. Nothing that alarmed me. I sat there for a while, staring at the flames until my eyes grew heavy, and eventually crawled into my tent. That first night, I slept fine. The second day, I hiked deeper into the forest without my gear, just to look around. I followed deer tracks, noticed a few muddy impressions that looked like they belonged to a black bear, and even spotted a hawk circling overhead. The day was uneventful, but as I walked back to camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. The clearing didn't look the way I left it. At first, I thought I was imagining it. My tent was still there, the fire pit was still blackened with ash, my pack leaned against the log. But something was off. The sticks I had gathered the night before were scattered, not neatly stacked as I had left them. My tent flap, which I had zipped all the way shut, was halfway open. I stood there for a long time, staring. My mind ran through possibilities. Maybe an animal nosed around. A raccoon could have tugged the flap. A squirrel could have messed with the sticks. It made sense, but something about it didn't sit right. Animals left signs. They knocked over food, left droppings, claw marks, chewed edges. But none of that was there. I pushed it out of my head and went about making dinner again. I rebuilt my little fire, ate quietly, and watched the trees sway. But my nerves were sharper now. I caught myself turning around too often, staring into the woods like I expected something to be there. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing faint noises. Not the typical forest background I was used to, but sharper, more deliberate ones. A stick cracking just beyond the tent. A rustle of leaves that carried weight, not the light brushing of a rabbit. Every time I opened my eyes and listened, it would stop. By dawn, I was exhausted, but I told myself I was overreacting. I made coffee on my small camp stove, sat on the fallen tree, and tried to enjoy the early morning air. But then I noticed something else. There were boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I checked. My boots were heavy hiking ones with thick tread. These were different, flatter, more worn, like old work boots. They weren't clear enough to tell size, but they were distinct enough to know what they were. And they led right up to my tent, circled around, and then disappeared into the trees. That realization left me cold. I sat there staring at them for what felt like forever. Whoever it was had come into my camp during the night. Maybe while I was asleep. Maybe while I was lying awake listening. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and hiking back to the trail. But a part of me wanted to believe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Maybe some hunter passed through, curious about my setup. Maybe it was nothing more than that. I stayed. That evening, I didn't bother with a fire. I ate cold food, kept the light of my flashlight low, and sat in my tent earlier than usual. My heart was thumping in a way I couldn't control. Every sound outside now felt amplified. Every shift of wind in the trees, every acorn dropping from above, every movement in the leaves had me frozen. Hours passed like that. My nerves were frayed, and I was almost about to convince myself that I had worked myself up for nothing when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, careful, crunching lightly on the forest floor. They circled the clearing. I held my breath, staring at the thin fabric of my tent as if I could see through it. My flashlight was off, but even if it had been on, I don't know if I would have turned it toward the noise. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped near the log. I could hear the faint creak of wood, as if someone sat down right where I had been sitting earlier that morning. I waited, frozen, my body tense and aching from stillness. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My ears picked up the faint sound of breathing outside. At some point, I must have drifted in and out of a half-sleep, because when I opened my eyes again, the first pale light of dawn was pushing through the tent fabric. The clearing was silent. I unzipped my tent slowly, my hands shaking, and looked around. Whoever it had been was gone. But there on the log, pressed into the mossy wood, was the mark of dirt from where they had been sitting. That was enough. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. My tent went into the bag half folded, my gear shoved in without care. I just wanted out. I threw my pack on my shoulders and started back toward the trail as fast as I could manage. My head whipped back every few minutes, scanning the trees. When I finally reached my car, parked in the small gravel lot by the trailhead, I tossed everything inside and sat there gripping the wheel. I was covered in sweat even though the air was cold. My throat was dry. I forced myself to look around the lot before turning the key. It was empty, not another car in sight. I drove the whole way back to town without stopping, and when I got home, I locked the door and sat in silence for hours. I never reported it. I didn't know what I would even say. No crime had technically been committed. No face, no name, no confrontation. Just the heavy certainty that someone had been out there, walking my camp at night, watching me while I lay in my tent. I never went camping alone again.